will they not say you're mad? Did you hear that? You kind of want to say, well, hold it, Paul. You just said in verse 22 that tongues are a sign for the unlearned to get their attention. And then in verse 23, you turn right around and say, if somebody starts speaking in tongues in church and there are unbelievers there, they'll think you're nuts. Now, see, the only way you're going to understand that, because then he says, now, if you prophesy, then it'll open up their heart to God. See, the Holy Ghost wasn't contradicting himself. See, when Paul says tongues are for a sign to unbelievers, remember verse 5? When Paul says, even though it says tongues are a sign to unbelievers, that means tongues with interpretation of tongues. It's always got to be there. See, Paul laid the groundwork. He set that in motion in verse 5. That goes through the whole rest of that chapter. Okay? Tongues and interpretation of tongues. So what Paul was saying there, he was saying tongues with interpretation of tongues, which acts as prophecy, are a sign to unbelievers. But if they come into your church and they just hear two people give messages in tongues, an unbeliever hears two people give messages in tongues, and there's no interpretation, then they think you're crazy. Right. So see, now you see how verses 22 and 23 don't contradict, they flow right together. But it won't make sense to you if you don't realize when Paul says tongues, he means with interpretation of tongues. Right. Y'all got that? Yeah. Yeah. That's really important. You say, well, why is that so important, a message in tongues to an unbeliever? Well, down here, look down in, look at verse 27, same chapter. If any man speak, here's where he's given divine order. If any man speak, remember man means male or female. If any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by two or at the most by three, and that by course, and let one interpret. So there's another confirmation of verse 5. You've got to always interpret a message spoken in tongues if there's more than you speaking it, more than one person there hearing it. If it's just you, you don't have to interpret it because you edify yourself by praying in tongues. But if I just start speaking in tongues, I'm going to get edified. If I stand here and speak in tongues for an hour, man, I'm going to get really edified and built up. But if I don't interpret it back in English, that won't mean nothing to you guys. Y'all won't be edified a bit. Not a drop. So he says, make sure, notice, here's the divine order. Let it be by two or at the most by three, and that by course. That by course. And that means not at the same time. Yeah, Joe and Miss Bridget and, you know, and